This is our last class in James, and what I'd like to do today is just spend some time just going through the book of James, making a few comments, devotional points, observations, things that have been a blessing to me, challenge at times. Just quickly to give you an overview, I personally believe that the book of James is a lot like 1 John, because both 1 John and James are challenging us to prove outwardly our faith. And James gives us a number of ways that you test your faith, that you prove or demonstrate that you're truly a believer. One way is how you handle suffering. The first chapter. A true Christian. First, let me just name the ways that James touches on, and then we'll come back and deal with them separately. But the first one, in the first part of chapter 1, the way you handle trial and testing is one way to demonstrate your faith. Another way you demonstrate your faith is your lifestyle. The end of chapter 1 is obedience. Whether you're a doer or just a professor. He suggests or intimates that a mere hearer is not really a believer. Another way that you show your faith in chapter 2, the first is basically your works, that you are non-judgmental, that you're a loving person, and the whole of chapter 2 really focuses on that you're not partial in your treatment of different people, treating them differently. A true believer treats everybody the same. That's a manifestation of his inner faith outwardly in works, like Abraham and Rahab and so forth. Another way you prove your faith is by the control that you have over your tongue, whether you're self-controlled in speech, in chapter 3. Another way in chapter 4 that you demonstrate your faith is how you relate to the world. The world of Christians, the world, the world in the way we normally think of it as enmity with God, and the world, the spiritual world, the devil and his angelic beings. I think they're all implied there. And the way we handle the world. A true Christian does not fight with the world of believers. He is not too much of a friend with the world that is fighting against God, and he certainly resists the world of the spiritual, the occultic, and he draws near to God. Another way that we demonstrate our faith, the end of chapter 4 and the beginning of chapter 5, is in our business dealings, that we demonstrate a life of faith even there. And I really enjoyed watching this videotape last night by Jim Sammons, who was associated with the Institute for Basic Youth Conflicts with Bill Gothard, and his series on financial freedom. And he was pointing out that God's word means what it says when it says that we should not owe any man anything. He believes that the scriptures teach that it's wrong for Christians to go into debt, and that being indebted to another person, according to Deuteronomy 28, 29, and 30, is a sign of divine judgment. And so it's scriptural to, if we are in debt, to attempt to get out of debt, and if we are out of debt, to stay out of debt. And he gave lots of examples and he says basically it requires faith, but not too much faith. Pardon?
How does he define debt?
Owing somebody something, money, period. And it's kind of a radical principle. Very few Christians operate on that level today. And so this is one of the ways that we demonstrate our faith, in our business dealings. Do you look at it from the current worldly perspective, or do you trust God, in essence, to supply for your needs? Do you look out for number 1, which is the attitude of chapter 5 here, that you take advantage of other people and hurt them, so that you your nest is feathered or what. Another attitude towards, or another demonstration of faith, is your specific relationship to believers in the church. And that's the way the 5th chapter ends. He doesn't mention church, but he does talk about the afflicted and the sick. And he does talk about the church in verse 14, calling for the elders of the church. He talks about confessing faults one to another and seeking to convert fellow believers that have fallen into sin from their errors. And so your involvement in the local church, in the life of the body, is one of the ways that you demonstrate your faith. Now let's go back through it. I'd just like to, before we do that, I just want to mention that John, in 1 John, gives a number of specific tests. And he says a man can say he's a Christian, but if he doesn't love his brother, he's a liar. A man can say he's a Christian, but unless he's living a purified life, he's a liar. A man can say he's a Christian, but if his lifestyle is a lifestyle of sin, he's a liar. And John basically takes the same practical approach to Christian living that James does. They're both really good books. We've used both of these books at various times over the years as a grounds for our Vacation Bible School. And it's really neat how you can get 5 real neat lessons out of each of these books. 5 out of James and 5 out of John, and we've developed them before. And they make very practical teaching for kids in Vacation Bible School. Now let's go back to chapter 1 and talk about suffering for a minute. You probably all heard people quote this to you when you're having trouble. My brothers, count it all joy when you fall into various tribulations. Count it all joy. Well, it's easier said than done, isn't it? We all know that. No? No? Oh.
The second one I've heard of that.
What's that?
One is to try your faith with the patience.
Mm-hmm.
Or that one.
Mm-hmm. That troubles develop endurance, spiritual growth, character. Verse 4 is a significant verse. Let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, lacking nothing. Stop for a moment and just dwell on that. Our circumstances are continually changing, aren't they? My circumstances this week were not the same as last week. This week my daughter's in the hospital. I've been there for 3 days, I didn't see that coming last week. Right? So just as our day-by-day circumstances are never completely finished, they've never come to a completion. They're continually evolving. So we are, as believers in our inner person, are continually changing as well. This is important for us to remember, by the way, when we have had unfortunate dealings with other Christians. I've been through a number of church splits, and I know a lot of Christians that at one time they were pretty ignorant. They're pretty stupid. They're very un-Christ-like in their attitudes, or unethical in their dealings. One thing I need to realize as a Christian, I can take this from this, is that 10 years later, that person isn't necessarily the same person. No more so than I am the same person. Or you. See? So we have to realize that God is working His will in everybody's life as believers, and as time passes, our circumstances have a way of changing you, and a way of changing me. So 2 things are evolving at all times. Circumstances outside of me, and my own spiritual character within. And that's what I take out of verse 4. My responsibility as a Christian in difficult times is to let the continuously changing circumstances, which are not perfect, allow them to mature, allow them to transpire, allow them to progress, and have a maturing effect on me, bringing me to a more perfect condition. See? That's God's principle in leaving us in the world. Jesus said, I do not pray, Father, that you should take them out of the world, but that you leave them in the world, but sanctify them. Set them apart from sin. See? And that's just one of the unchangeables of life. We cannot do anything about it. Maybe if I had been the creator, I might have set up the rules a little differently. But we can't argue with this, and we should not. We should simply submit to it. Let means yield. It implies yielding to the way things are and being happy with it and conforming to God's law here. This is a law of spiritual life. Now, as he proceeds through this passage, he tells us that we can ask for understanding. That requires faith. And it really requires true faith, not just a little bit of faith. And regardless, look at the contrast in verses 9 and 10. Let the brother of low degree rejoice in that he is exalted. Isn't that what we mostly do? You're down here in the doldrums and the pits, and then something good happens and you're raised up and exalted. We mostly rejoice in that, right? But James turns it around and says, you ought to be happy if you're rich and you're made low. See? James says, verse 12, blessed is the man that endures temptation. Because when you're tried, you shall receive the crown of life. If you have a trial and you remain steadfast to the Lord in a trial, that's doing something for you. You know, that's something the Lord is going to bless you for. And we all go through that. There isn't one of us that doesn't go, Blair wrecked his truck at the beginning of school this year. That was a trial. Now, I don't know how you handled it. I thought you handled it pretty good. Some people have sick kids, how do they handle that? Other people lonely or feel isolated or struggling with personal problems or maybe attacked by friends or whatever. There are 1,001 ways that we endure temptation. External things are continually changing. What it's like today isn't necessarily what's going to be like tomorrow. I remember the morning after my wife and I were married, we went to the Holiday Inn for our honeymoon night, and that next morning, Sunday morning, we were watching television. This guy was on, his name was William Medema. He was a preacher from California. And I never forgot that man's message. It's one of the best messages I ever heard in my life. But he preached, and he said it real simple. He was talking about suffering in the life of a Christian. He said, you can know with certainty that if things are going good today, they'll be bad tomorrow.
First day, bitch.
That's why
And I don't recall if that's why it stuck in my mind, or if it was simply that he was so well put. I never heard it put that way.
When you brought it up.
Yeah.
First day of my marriage.
And he also said, well, and you can also know for certain that if things are bad today, then they will probably be better tomorrow. Well, it works both ways. Our circumstances are continually changing. Now, one specific aspect of trial and tribulation is the way it develops in a natural person. And he talks about the contrast here in verses 13 and following, that don't react in a fleshly way. Don't charge God with it. You ever seen an unsaved person get angry at God? Sure, I've seen it. The whole problem of evil in the world is something that unsaved persons make a big fist in God's face, that if there really is a loving God, then how come it's like this? Right? And they use that as an excuse. And people, we are warned by James, let no man say, hey, this is God's fault. It's wrong to react that way. Okay? In fact, what we're supposed to do is recognize the deceitfulness and depravity of our own nature. That's the solution. That's really the answer. That's the explanation for why there's so much trouble in the world. It's not God's fault that there was a war in the Middle East. It was Saddam Hussein and the sinful, depraved nature of man that caused it. That's what happened. Okay? So when he says in verse 16, do not err, my beloved brethren, in the context, what is he talking about? Maybe you could draw that out of it. I think that in the immediate context, he's saying don't yield to your natural inclinations when you're faced with trial and temptation. That's sin. To charge God with it is wrong. Now, either view would probably be there's grounds for that. Now, on an unrelated note, verse 17 is a familiar verse. We all probably have memorized it one time or another. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. Comes down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning.
Yeah.
What's the matter? Oh. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above. comes down from the Father. That's a wonderful principle. It applies not only to salvation, but it applies to our daily Christian lives too. Every good gift, everything good that happens in life comes from God. Right? And every perfect gift, even circumstances are a perfect gift. I mean, this is the same terminology here. Verse 3? Let patience have her perfect work. Let your circumstances let God work it out. Let God bring these, seemingly unfortunate circumstances to a point of completion. Let them work themselves out before you rush away, before allowing them to have the proper effect on you. And so that is conceived as a gift. It's a perfect gift. That word perfect is a key word here in the book of James. I use this as a grounds for a Bible lesson, a series of study that I did down in Illinois that time when you guys went down with us that summer, right? When I taught the teens there, I used this as sort of like a springboard. Every perfect gift is from the Father, comes down. Every good gift and every perfect gift. So I tied a series of 5 gifts together, and this is God's gifts to us. And I just simply did a series on salvation that, one aspect of salvation is justification. Another one is sanctification. Another one is redemption. Another one is reconciliation. Another is imputation. They're all gifts within the wonderful gift of salvation, right? Ephesians 2:8-9. For by grace you saved through faith. It's not of yourselves. It is a gift of God. So within a gift, a bunch of little gifts. You ever got a gift like that? It's neat. And that's the way we should view. These circumstances that we're in today are like a gift from God. It's good. We know it's good, even if it looks bad. Right? Romans 8:28. We know that all things work together for good to them that love Christ. And so our circumstances should be conceived as a good gift. Now there might be 10 different aspects to this gift. Right? So it's our job to stay under the circumstances, not run away, rebel, or get angry with God and react in a fleshly way, but sit there, ask for wisdom, trust Him, patiently endure it, and look for that whatever it is that He's doing there to perfect our character. That's really the message of James 1. I'm not going to talk about the end of James 1 because that's pretty self-explanatory. Be doers of the word and not just hearers. I think verse 26 and 27 are the applications. Your tongue, right? Don't just talk about being a Christian, but allow it to affect your speech. Be a witness. Be self-controlled. And then have pure religious service. Visiting. How many of you people make a point of looking after the underdog in the young people's group, for example? When this is true religion. This is being doers of the word. Is when you do the jobs or perform the functions that are not in the limelight, visiting the fatherless and the widows in their affliction, and to keep your own self unspotted from the world. The essence of the Christian life is pretty private. I mean, real Christian living is private. Not that it doesn't have an external aspect, but how many people know that you visit unfortunate people? So this is something you should cultivate. Christ cultivated it. I mean, this is His example. He sat down with Zacchaeus, and He sat down with the prostitutes and the tax collectors, the people that were the so-called scum of society. We should be willing to reach out. Discrimination is a terrible thing, and chapter 2 gives us a few principles on that. The 10 Commandments, by the way, are quoted here. Did you know that? Verse 8, if ye fulfill the royal law according to the Scripture, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Actually, that's not one of the 10 Commandments, but it's based on Levitical instructions. Leviticus 19:18. Love your neighbor as yourself. We're responsible. Isn't it interesting? It calls it there the royal law in verse 8. And up in verse 12, it calls it the law of liberty. Two different emphases of the same standard of Christian behavior. It's something that comes down from the very throne of heaven to treat people the same way, and it's a law of liberty. We're free to act, but we should not abuse our liberty. Isn't it interesting that law of liberty, that phrase in verse 12, is sort of mutually exclusive, isn't it? Isn't it almost contradictory? We as Christians are governed by a law of liberty. I'm free, right? I'm free from the law, the demands of the law. I don't have to keep the ceremony, the ritual, right? We were talking about that in theology this morning. Christ has done away with the need for sacrifices. He's done away with the typology. He's done away with circumcision. All the need for ritual. He's done away with it. But the moral requirements of the law remain unchanged. That's the unchanging divine government in the universe. It is governed by the ethics of the Ten Commandments. It continues unchanged. The royal law, God's sovereign law, that remains constant through time. In the kingdom, the Ten Commandments are going to be just as applicable as they are today as they were in Moses' day. The Ten Commandments. In the sense of their moral, the moral and ethical sense. Whether or not keeping the Sabbath is, I don't think so. But so we're free from certain things, but we're never free from the sovereign laws, the ethical and moral and spiritual laws that govern behavior. So there's a nice balance there on the one hand. Those two phrases in chapter 2, the royal law refers to the universal and eternal, I believe, sovereign spiritual laws that govern, and they can be basically, on a practical level, be summarized in that one statement: love your neighbor as yourself. But there's liberty in that too. And I'm not going to talk about this discussion of justification in chapter 2 because we've already done that before. In chapter 3, when James challenges us to watch our speech, the principle is, in verse 2, in many things we all stumble. If any man offend not in word, the same as a perfect man. There you have that word perfect again. Mature, complete, well developed in the sense of growing spiritually. That's the idea of perfect. And if you can control your speech, that's a pretty good indicator of what kind of spiritual maturity you have. And able also to bridle the whole body. Notice the examples that he gives here. A bit is a very small instrument, isn't it? A bit in a horse's mouth. The same thing with a rudder. In verse 4, a great ship is turned by the very small helm. And the littleness of the bit and the littleness of the helm is compared to the littleness of the tongue, which has great consequences, or great issues are decided by the tongue. For example, fire is a big thing. Right? And there are some pretty big animals in the world, verse 7. And poison can be a pretty big thing. And the tongue is compared to the determinative factor in all of these. It's an either-or situation, too. It's unfortunate, but the reality is, in verse 10, that most of us have a mouth that out of the same mouth proceeds blessing and cursing. This is inconsistent. It ought not to be. It's contrary to nature. A fountain, uses verse 11, doesn't have two kinds of water, it just has one. And so we are left. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 15? He says, it's not what a person puts into them that defiles them. It's what comes out of their mouth that defiles them. Remember that? Out of the heart proceedeth all these rotten things. Well, this is sort of the analogy in James chapter 3, that your mouth is the external conduit. It's the means by which the wisdom, the philosophy of life that's locked up inside of you becomes manifest. And that's why at the end of this chapter he focuses on wisdom. He contrasts wisdom from above, which is godly wisdom, to wisdom that is below or demonic. And even the philosophy, the wisdom, the understanding is identifiable. And it comes out in speech in different ways. So when he says in verse 16 and 17 and 18, and where envy and strife are, there is confusion and every evil work. Well, envy, strife, and confusion and evil works are usually instigated by speech, aren't they? Not sign language, speech. It's people talking that creates these things. The wisdom that is from above is first pure, then peaceable, right? You either have peacemaking sort of speakers, you have gentle speakers, you have speakers that are easily entreated, you have merciful speakers, you have good speakers, you have fair speakers, unhypocritical speakers, peacemaking, righteous speakers, or you have the opposite. Now, I don't believe that this references to wisdom and all that down at the end of this third chapter is unrelated to this discussion on the tongue up at the beginning of the chapter. The tongue is merely the method by which the wisdom becomes manifest. And if we're truly Christians, then, as Paul says in Ephesians chapter 4, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth. I'll read that, because I can't quote it all. But that which is good to the use of edifying, that it may minister grace to the hearers. And stop grieving the Holy Spirit of God, by whom you are sealed to the day of redemption. Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and evil speaking be put away from you with all malice. This is something I'm trying to build into my kids, and it seems like it's an impossible job. It just, the corruption of the human nature just is just locked in there. And listen to kids talk, constantly nattering and antagonizing and bad things, evil speaking. It's just not normal. And so it takes the work of the Holy Spirit in their lives to change them into being what they should be. Chapter 4, verses 13 and following. Come now, ye that say today or tomorrow we will go into such a city, and continue there a year, and buy and sell and get gain. Whereas you know not what shall be on the next day. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes away. For you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now you rejoicing in their boastings, and all such rejoicing is evil. Therefore to him that knoweth do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. This is an outlook on life and a life-altering principle if you'll just practice it. If you'll begin to institute it in your own experience. Live every day as if it was your last. Right? When you make plans, don't forget to pray about it. Don't forget to ask God if He really wants you to do this. Always subject your plans to the scrutiny of the sovereign God. Be willing to change. Be willing to to scrap your plans and allow Him to change it. If the Lord wills, we'll do this or that. Don't brag about what you're going to do. That's dangerous. That's a very dangerous, fleshly attitude. It's an unbelieving attitude, and true Christians are to be demonstrated by a desire to trust the Lord. Getting back to this debt thing, Salmon's pointed out something that's true about debt that is implicit, rarely stated. But when you borrow money, you're presuming on the future, aren't you? If you borrow $30,000 or $50,000 or $60,000 to buy a house, a mortgage, are you not presuming that you're going to be employed for the next 30 years? Are you not presuming that you're going to have health to look after it? And I realize you can get insurance to cover these sorts of things. I've got it myself. I got life insurance policy that, if I lose my job or I get sick or something, that they automatically kick in and they make my payments until I'm able to do it, to continue to make my payments. That's great. It's neat. But debt presumes upon the future. He gave all kinds of examples. He gave the example of one guy. He and his wife got married, and within a short time, like just in a matter of months after they were married, they charged $25,000 worth of furniture and appliances for their new home as newlyweds to charge cards. Right? They basically borrowed the money to get this stuff. As soon as he did it, he got drafted. He lost his high-paying job and he had to work in the army. And 10 years later, they had lost every bit of that stuff that they had bought on time, and they were still paying for it. And I've heard people come to college here, lamenting the fact that they borrowed money to buy this car and they borrowed money to buy that thing, and cars wear out, die, crash, get buried. They're still paying on the debts years down the road. It does not pay to presume upon the future. And he's suggesting that it's wrong for a Christian to borrow money because you're basically not trusting God. You're trusting in your own circumstances and in yourself. Some people go beyond trusting themselves to actually abusing others, and that's what's talked about in the first few verses of chapter 6. One more portion here before we leave it. There's a fascinating scripture here in chapter 5, verses 13 to 15 or 16. Is any among you afflicted? Let him pray. Is any merry? Let him sing psalms. If any sick among you, let him call for the elders of the church, and let them pray over him, anointing him with oil in the name of the Lord. And the prayer of faith shall save the sick, and the Lord shall raise him up, and if he have committed sins, they shall be forgiven him. Confess your faults one to another, and pray one for another, that you may be healed. The fervent, effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much. Now, the real issue here, of course, interpretive, is what? What's the issue here in this passage? Okay, prayer, helping each other. The issue that has divided Christians to this day is whether or not this is justification for faith healers. Just is this or is this not grounds for the practice of faith healing? Right. Right. It does talk about calling for the elders of the church and let them pray over you. Right. Well, we won't be able to get into all the ins and outs of it today, of course, but notice the context. He talks about people being afflicted in verse 13, right? In verse 14, he talks about the sick. In verse 15, he talks about saving the sick and the sick being raised up. And if the sick same person apparently has committed sins, they shall be forgiven. So it seems to, sometimes it could be talking about physical sickness, and sometimes it could be talking about spiritual sickness as well, right? Sin. And he talks about faults needing to be healed in verse 16. See that? He actually uses faults needing to be healed. And before a person is going to take verse 14 and say, oh, this is grounds that the elders, if you have tonsillitis or appendicitis or cancer or whatever, that this is grounds. God says that just get your elders to come and pray for you for physical healing. There may be more involved. This passage actually may be teaching specifically that may be limited rather to situations where people are physically sick due to spiritual sin. And that's the way I interpret it. I think that there are some sicknesses that are nothing more than the judgment of God on a Christian's life. There are, some people develop ulcers and psychosomatic illnesses and stuff like that as a result of sin in their lives, right? And I believe specifically that that's what it refers to. I don't think this is carte blanche for any kind of sickness. I think that it's connected here to a person's spiritual condition, their spiritual status seems to be intimately related. Now, having said that, I don't believe that there's anything against physical healing either. It certainly appears to relate to physical problems, and that perhaps we in faith should practice this more. The timing of the book of James may have something to say about this. When is James written? It seems to be probably one of the earliest in the New Testament books. If that's the case, we're talking about early in the apostolic age, when the apostles themselves, like Peter and Paul and all those guys, were walking around healing people regularly. And that may have a bearing on how applicable that is today. Okay? Did accept it, and Christ able yet speaks, continuing message, still a faithful witness. But no, there is not a specific place in the New Testament where Christ is directly parallel. So you should make a note of that. No, there is not. This is inferred. It's not stated. Adam. Where is Adam? Parallel to Christ? Romans 5. Where else? There's 2 chapters in the Bible. 1 Corinthians chapter 15. That they're actually mentioned. And they're contrasted one to the other. Where, Benjamin. Is Benjamin mentioned in the New Testament? Oh boy, good question. He is mentioned in the New Testament?
Yeah, it's a good question.
Pardon? Oh, he is, eh? Well, that's just the genealogy, isn't it?
Luke 2:35.
To my knowledge, there is no place where Benjamin and Christ are specifically connected. Right? That's another inferred type, just from the details of his life. right? I mean, what was it about, what are the parallels between Benjamin and Christ? Can you think of any? Where does the parallel start? Sons of Abraham, right? Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Benjamin. So Benjamin was descended from Abraham, so they're both sons of Abraham. Secondly, they're both in the line of promise, right? Through Jacob, right? Benjamin was Joseph was the specially loved one of the father. But Benjamin is the son of my right hand. Benjamin ben Yahmin. See, that's Hebrew for son of my right hand. Okay, that's basically the parallel, right there. Okay. Well, I realize that it's eating into your lunch hour. It's very hard to concentrate. Eating into your lunch hour. One more, David. Is David paralleled to Christ anywhere in the Bible?
It's just inferred, isn't it?
Oh no, there's many direct references.
Oh, yeah, okay. Knox,
Like,
where he quotes Psalm 2 or something to it.
sure. Peter's sermon in Acts 2 and in Acts 4, he keeps hitting it, you know.
Plus the Gospels, son of David.
Right, the very first verse of the New Testament. The book of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, the son of David. Son of David, son of Abraham, in that order. Right? So, Matthew 1:1, Acts 2, Acts 4. Any other references that refer to Christ being king? You know, his nativity, the angelic announcements, King of Israel, throne of David. His titles, Christ's kingly titles. Well, I said one more. That's it. We'll pick it up next class. If you had not finished reading this chapter, or if you haven't made notes, I would suggest that you go through and fill out parallels and contrasts and try to focus on, you know, what is the primary point. You know, why is Aaron used in a parallel to Christ? What's the main idea there under each of these headings? I think you'll be blessed from it. So I really enjoy typology. I used to have a bad attitude towards it because I didn't like subjectivity. You know, it was too nebulous for me. But once you recognize where the danger lies, well, you can live with it as long as you're careful. Right?